there's one for the Carrolls, I think.
What's that?
No, I know somebody had done kind of like a family tree.
I mean, I have a copy of one at home, Sue did one.
You have one, right?
Yeah. I mean,
Okay, we've got the mill house here.
nice.
Where
Now, who are the Millhops?
my mother's family. My mother's family. Dorothy Millhopt and Charles Matthew Glenn Carroll. My dad.
Okay. So on the Millhops side, that's your mom's family.
That's
Were they from Wisconsin also?
Yes, well, I mean,
Obviously.
yeah,
Well, how
it's just going.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
how many generations were in Wisconsin, or was it just your?
Well, for the Millhops, I think the only be able to go back to was before Conrad. I'm not sure of that. Basically, I think mid 1800s.
Really?
You know, yeah, there was
So a couple generations in Wisconsin.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay.
I knew that New Holstein was a place where many of them had lived at one time. And one of the...
That's in Wisconsin?
Yeah, New Holstein is south of Appleton. One of the aunts was a nun from St. Mary's College in South Bend. She was part of that order.
One of your mom's sister?
Well, no, it was one of our, you're right, one of our, I think, great aunts or great aunts.
Okay.
And she was a nurse in the Civil War and is buried in South Bend.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
But otherwise, my mother's father, Conrad, I believe was an orphan and grew up in New Holstein, south of Appleton. And came up to Appleton. I don't know where he met, he's married twice, wasn't he?
Yeah,
Conrad?
right.
And I'm sorry, who's Conrad?
Conrad was our grandfather, my mother's father,
Mother's father. Okay.
Conrad Millhopt, and had two families. His first wife died,
Okay.
and
He married her sister, his wife's sister.
okay,
Really?
yeah.
That's interesting.
And you knew her before she died. So.
Yeah, I knew her,
What was her first name?
Anna, wasn't
Anna.
it?
Okay. So,
And
but
so this would have been late 1800s?
yeah, his first wife died.
Because your grandparents.
My grandparents, and so I knew her a little bit, and so she would have died probably in the early 40s, 1940, something. That's what I was looking
Gotcha.
to see if we had any, but we don't. This is about my mother, but our mother's brothers and
Mother's side.
sisters.
Okay. Is that what Sue put together?
No, put
sisters.
together by some cousins in California
Okay.
in 1986.
Okay.
20 years old.
So then your so then your grandfather had his first wife passed away and then got remarried.
Right,
To Anna.
Okay. And,
Yeah.
and is that who you knew as your grandmother?
yeah.
Okay.
I didn't. She was gone by the time I was born in 1944.
Okay.
But our grandfather, Conrad, started a business in Appleton
Mm-hmm.
and was quite successful. He began making wagons
Wagons.
before there were automobiles.
Okay. Like horse-drawn wagons.
Exactly.
Okay.
And I don't know exactly what kind, but once automobile came along, he got into selling Nash automobiles. That was a
Packards,
pack.
yeah, with the Packards.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Interesting.
Because our father later had a
Oh,
pack
okay, that's right. Oh, so he had a wagon dealership, so to speak,
Right,
before the
before the
horseless carriage.
That's
Right.
interesting. Okay.
right.
Okay.
So he just switched to
Got with the times.
the times. Yeah.
Okay.
But he is from a strong German background, German-American background.
Okay.
And it's interesting, the attitude towards the church. My father was from an Irish Catholic background,
Okay.
where the priest was on a very high pedestal. I mean, whatever the priest said was, the word.
Right.
especially because the pastor when my dad was young, in his parish of St. Mary's in Appleton was Monsignor Fitzmaurice, who was there probably for 30, 40 years, I think, at St. Mary's from the 1880s to the late 20s, I think. And as they say, many people like my dad thought the sun rose and set on Monsignor Fitzmaurice. But my mother reflected more her father's attitude, which was a bit anti-clerical. And one time she said that the priest from St. Joseph's Parish, which is 3 blocks away, the German parish, where the Gould-Ralphs were members, this priest was a Capuchin priest, Capuchin Franciscan, came to see my grandfather to get a donation for some type of a building program. And apparently my grandfather, he expected my grandfather to give a sizable donation because he was a successful businessman. And when this didn't work out, the priest tried to shame him by saying that he had just seen such and such a widow and she had given a healthy amount, at which point my grandfather said, "You ought to be ashamed asking her to give money like that, she can't afford it."
Turn the tables.
Is there any other Millhop memories from that era that you remember?
Well, when Conrad died, I mean, first of all, there were 9 children
On the
Yeah,
top side.
on the Millhop side. 2, Arthur and Gertrude from the first marriage, Conrad and I can't remember what her name was. Then Conrad married Anna, who was a younger sister, and they had 7 children.
Okay.
All right. Two of the sons, Edgar and Leo, took over the Millhop dealership.
Okay.
And so I don't know, somehow along the line, Edgar bought out Leo.
Okay.
And it was not exactly, from what I learned this past summer, it was not exactly totally without some negative feelings on Leo's part.
Oh, Edgar alone or Edgar and John bought him out?
But John is the son of Edgar.
No. John Millhop is a brother to Edgar, to Bing.
I know, but this is their father.
Oh, I see.
Their father, and who was mother's brothers, 2 brothers, Leo and Edgar. And
Well, how about why don't you tell me about where your mom? Where was she in the mix of the 7?
well,
of the 7
she's
kids?
down near the
Second to the end, huh? That was third to the end, I think.
third. There was Isabel and Joe and Veronica. So my mother was 4th from the young. So she was, if there were 7, so she was 3rd. Right, the boys were older.
And about when? Do you know when she was born?
In 1898.
She was born in 1898.
Right.
My father was born in 1894. So he was 4 years old.
Okay.
Right.
And growing up, did you see your aunts and uncles and cousins? Were they all part? I mean, they're all in Appleton, right?
They were all in Appleton. No, we didn't.
You
I
see them?
didn't. Now maybe my older sisters had more interface because they were about the same age as those cousins,
The Millhops.
the Millhops.
Mhm.
I don't have any memories particularly of that. Who I remember is my Aunt Isabel, who was just younger than my mother, and she and her husband were able to have children. And after Michael was born, they adopted a son, Peter, and that was their only child.
Okay.
And mother was close to her, like our dad worked, and most of the time he works 5.5 days, maybe 6 days a week. Sometimes he'd be home at noon on Saturday. So mother was really a hands-on person. So Isabel would come over and they would like paint. The things that sort of the minor repairs and maintenance in the house, she did.
Okay.
And Isabel helped her with a lot of that.
And your mom always stayed at home when you guys
She
were
always
kids?
stayed at home.
Did she have a second career like maybe she had before the kids were born, or was it always
She was a nurse.
nurse? Okay.
She was an RN, but being an RN then was not really like being an RN now. like Kelly. I mean, she just, they were more like handmaidens to the doctors. They were probably, maybe what they did was more like the kind of care that Kelly Jarrett does now for nurses' aides.
Okay.
All right, it wasn't terribly medical and scientific background. So she did work.
But while you guys were kids, she was always at home full time.
Right.
There's an interesting story too, she told me about going to Milwaukee to St. Mary's nursing school. And she was there during the First World War, but when these influenza, worldwide influenza outbreak took place, was it 1917, I think, or 1918? That which year it was. Millions of people around the world died of influenza.
Yeah.
And her father ordered her back to Appleton so that she would not become infected.
Okay.
So mom did not get influenza.
Okay.
But she went back and
So she was a nurse, like a practicing nurse at that time.
no, she was in school at
She
the
was
time.
in school. Okay.
But her dad did not want her in Milwaukee at the time,
Okay.
on her home. But her relationship with my dad was developing at that time.
Okay.
I mentioned he was 4 years older, and in fact, when she was in high school, she got a job at what was called the Five and Dime store
Okay.
downtown, and she worked there. My father was what they called an assistant floor walker, meaning an assistant manager.
Okay.
And she thought he was a real pill.
Okay.
He was rather stern and seemed kind of aloof, and she thought he was just full of himself. So she didn't like him at all.
And how old were they at that time?
Well, that would have been she was in high school, so 1914, 1915 probably.
Okay.
So the First World War broke out, and we declared war in 1917, so about that time Dad was in the Army and was sent to Puerto Rico. He was far away from the action, fortunately.
Right.
And he had been dating my mother's older sister, Olive, and was corresponding with her. Of course, he was pretty lonely, and so he would write like every day. And Olive was just having a difficult time keeping up with him.
Oh, okay.
So she said to Mother, she said, Dorothy, would you please help me write to Glenn? I can't keep up with him.
Okay.
So Mother started writing to Dad, and pretty soon Dad was writing to Mother and not to Olive anymore.
Okay. And your mom's name was Dorothy, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
So he came out of the Army, got a job with Combined Locks Paper Company, their headquarters downtown Appleton. And my mother was in Milwaukee at the nursing school, and he would take the train down every weekend that he could, what we call the Northwestern train, and would try to woo Mother. And Mother told me, she said, I could have done much better than your father. She said, I could have dated doctors, but your father was persistent.
And is that true? Do you think she could have? I mean.
Oh, sure, she was in medical school. She had access to doctors.
Okay.
But he was very, very persistent. He just was very much taken with her.
Yeah.
And she said the turning point came, she knew that he had a very, very strong Irish temper. And she was a bit afraid of that. And one time they had a big fight. And Mother told me, she said, I know it was mainly my fault. But the fight took place, and your father left. And the next day, there was a ring at my doorbell. And there was a delivery man there with a dozen American roses from your father. And in classical female thinking, she said, any man who would do that would be a wonderful husband and father.
And so I've thought about that, but I've thought about it from the point of view too of what that meant, a dozen American roses at that point in time. Now we can see stands and stuff and you say roses for $9.95 or so forth. Well, first of all, they weren't as readily available. And number two, how much money was he making? That was proportion-wise probably a huge investment for him.
Yeah.
And then to pay for a delivery, the
Right.
whole piece of it
So she was,
was a very expensive thing to do.
Right. And hard, not easy thing to do do either.
And
right?
not an easy thing to do,
Yeah.
right, cause he was 100 miles away.
Though he probably was in Milwaukee overnight, or they were, I mean,
Oh,
they'd had the fight the night before,
okay.
But you just still, yeah.
yeah. Nancy's right, I mean, it was a major, and my mother saw it as a major statement. So she said that she would marry him under one condition, that he would never use his anger on her or the children.
Did your dad have a temper?
Oh, he had a terrible temper apparently,
Yeah.
but he never broke his promise.
Yeah. So as kids, you guys, that was never.
We never saw that.
How do you know how to? But how, besides your mom telling you, was there other stories?
Well, I think at work, I think it was clear that he had a temper. I think he was respected at work, but
Yeah.
if anywhere, that's probably where he might have shown some of his anger.
Yeah. Yeah. Did that come
He
from?
could, he could have a stern look,
Yeah.
you know, he has that, sort of that angular face
Yeah.
and prominent nose, and you can tell how he could have, had a stern look.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Right.
Very much so.
Now, we didn't talk about his family. Did that come from his side of the family, or was there? What? Maybe tell me a little bit about
The Carrolls.
the Carrolls. Yeah.
Well, probably. Maybe to tell a history about the Carrolls. As best we can tell, they came to this country from Ireland during the famine, probably 1847, 1848. They settled in Massachusetts, and I forgot the name of the town, but my father's grandfather, our great-grandfather Carroll, left his wife and his, I don't know how many children they had, and he went to work on the Illinois Central Railway here in the Midwest, and contracted cholera and died. So his wife was widowed, and so she had a brother, I think, or a cousin out in Wisconsin, in Chilton also. It's between New Holstein and Appleton. And there's a community of Irish there. And so she came out, moved to Chilton, and raised our grandfather, Dennis Carroll. And so he was raised in Chilton, and we know they did a number of things. One thing is that he helped haul stone for the construction of the large St. Mary's Church in Chilton, which was, I think, in the 1870s, if I'm not mistaken. He also went up north. He was a lumberjack for a time, up in the north woods of Wisconsin. And then he married, and they moved north of Appleton to an area called Mackville, and had a farm there, but that only lasted for 2 or 3 years at the most. He was not a successful farmer. So they moved to Appleton, and he got a job as a night policeman. And that's the job that he then held until he retired. So he was a night policeman in Appleton.
And at this point, before this, he was married, and your dad was born already, or was
No,
before he died?
they moved from Chilton to Mackville, I think before Dad died. I think that was in the late 1880s. I'm not sure, but I think they were living in Appleton, what we call South River Street, right overlooking the Fox River when Dad was born. Was he the youngest? Or?
He's the youngest.
Yeah.
Youngest of 10?
Wow, really?
No,
No?
But-
They had a smaller family than the house?
I think so. There were 4 boys and 2 or 3 girls.
Daisy, Jane,
3 girls, probably 7.
Mame. That was 3. And then there's Gerald, Glenn,
Francis,
Frank, and
Charles,
6. Right, so maybe there were 7.
Quite a big, decent sized family. Now, would they have come from middle class, poor, rich? I mean,
Well,
how would you say?
Dad's older sister, Jean, was Irish to the core. We grew up with every romantic story of the Irish that was possible. And she and her son Frank went out east many years ago to try to see if our family could be traced to the Carrolls who lived in Maryland, who came over with Lord Baltimore and included Charles Carroll of Carrollton, who signed the Declaration of Independence, Daniel Carroll, who signed the Constitution, Bishop John Carroll, the first bishop. These were the lace curtain Irish. Well, they failed in their mission, and it would appear that we were more than what we call the shanty Irish that came over. So, we definitely were not part of the upper crust. And, given Grandpa's being a night policeman, that was hardly
Yeah.
top shelf. But he did a good job, we respected. There was one historical piece that's surfaced, I forgot where I saw it, from the Appleton Post-President, talking about how Officer Carroll was called to a situation in Appleton where some guy was so drunk he couldn't even walk, and so he brought a wheelbarrow and took him home in the wheelbarrow. But Dad,
Early days.
yeah, but Dad grew up, as I mentioned before, at St. Mary's in Appleton, which was the Irish Catholic parish. In fact, that had been founded in 1858. It was the first Catholic parish in Appleton. But the Germans and the Dutch couldn't get along with the Irish and the French and the others, and so they started St. Joe's some years later, and that's why the Gould-Ralphs belonged to St. Joe's.
Oh, okay.
But the Carrolls continued to belong to St. Mary's, and so when Dad and Mom were married, in, I think it was 21 or 22, they were married at my mother's home parish, St. Joe's. But they belonged to St. Mary's to raise the family, because that's where my dad.
Okay. And the Millhops, Carroll's obviously Irish. Millhops are Irish also?
German.
German. Okay. Like 100% German or
Yeah,
strongly?
yeah.
Yeah, German, and Anna had, I always heard, had a little bit of
Wife.
the French. You know,
Yeah,
she was
you're
not
right.
100% German in her ancestry.
Okay.
Well, there was some question as to whether there was some Jewish blood along the line Mother talked about.
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, she, we didn't get into that in any depth. I remember when I was in high school, in the summer, coming home from ASCO, my job one afternoon, they said, "Hey, Mom, the guys at work, they call me Rabbi. They say I look Jewish." She looked at me, she said, "Yeah, you could pass for Jewish." My own mother, you know. But she was sometimes taken for Jewish also.
Yeah.
The olive skin and so forth.
Yeah.
But,
Good.
good.
Growing up, so when your family structure growing up, how many kids in the family?
6.
6 kids. What were the
5
oldest?
girls and Michael
Oldest to youngest.
is, do you want Pat? Patricia?
Yeah.
Was the oldest, and then Dorothy,
Mm-hmm.
and Suzanne, Glenna, myself, and then Michael.
Gotcha. What was the age difference like between you and Pat?
Good.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Pat
Well, it
Sellers,
was
right?
bad 21 years, I think.
21 years, really.
She was working in Milwaukee when I was I must have been about 3 or 4 years old, and she came home for a weekend. And when she left, I was in the tub. Mother was giving me a bath, and Mother went down to say goodbye to her, and she came back upstairs, and I says, "Mom, who was that lady? Is that your mother?" So she wrote to back and said, "You better come home more often. Your brother doesn't know who you are."
That's funny. Well, did you know, I mean, once you got a little bit older, did you know Pat very
Oh
much?
yeah,
growing up?
she
So she heeded your mom's words and came home more often?
yeah, she did. She married Vic Darnider. But let me just go back and tell a little known story of when she was in Milwaukee. She went down to nursing school, I think, but then she switched. But later on, one of her friends from that era was one of my parishioners at St. Mary's in Marion, and told me how she went to a Marquette football game with Pat and Mom and Dad, and she was so struck by how gracious and caring and gentlemanly our father was. He took care of, Mom and Pat and her friend, and he was a gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
So that was an
Is that-
interesting story from that period of time.
Is that how you saw him?
Oh,
growing up?
definitely.
Absolutely, absolutely.
He was a real servant.
Yeah. In his demeanor, sort of job wise, and
Oh, yeah.
what-
Let me just say a bit about John, and then let's get back to your question. He lived at a time when paper industry was the backbone of industry in the Fox River Valley. Kimberly Clark Mill, and then where he was with Combined Locks, and the other paper mills in the Fox River Valley, the 7 cities. And he told me that during the Depression, the Fox River Valley was one of the 2 areas least affected by the Depression.
Yeah.
The other one was in Connecticut, which is also a river along which there was many paper mills, because the paper industry was stable. And what they did is they would cut back the number of days the mill was open, so rather than firing them, so that everybody had some income
Mhm.
and they could take care of their families.
Mhm.
One other man, Jim Asmith, whose father owned another paper company, Wisconsin Tissue Mills, he mortgaged his home in Milwaukee to keep the factory going so that the men would not lose their jobs.
Okay.
In radical contrast to today when Kimberly-Clark Mill was bought out by a private venture firm that basically closed it because they wanted to consolidate the market.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so Dad grew up in that milieu, and he was known as being very concerned about the people that he worked with, whether it be the workers, the plant. He would walk through the plant every morning on his way to the office. You know, talk today about management being alienated from the workers. Well,
Yeah.
it was all part of everybody. It was part of the same family, so to
Yeah.
speak. You know. And so he wanted to make sure he knew what was happening before he went to the office. He was a purchasing agent.
Mhm.
He would buy all the materials, chemicals, and everything needed, and it was transportation had to be handled that. And they tell about how when people would come in and, or like the salesmen would come in, particularly if they were young salesmen, just starting the business, he would ask about the business, but then he would quickly switch subjects to how is your
About the family.
about the family. He'd tell me about your wife, tell me about your kids, and then he'd do everything he could to try to give this young salesman some type of an order. Encourage him.
We like those kind of purchasing agents.
Yeah. So you could understand what that means.
Yeah.
Right.
And when he died, John Geschwing, I remember, who had come in from the Air Force into the Valley, he was president of Albany International eventually. He said, you know, like when I came to the Valley from the Air Force, I thought if I was to get ahead, I'd have to be unethical, I'd have to cheat. But your father taught me I could be both a successful businessman and an honest one. And he said he made that difference in my life. So he was very highly respected, I think, as being ethical. And someone else made the comment that out of Unimore Country Club, that he would always want to know about the different workers out there and how they're, you know, how the families were doing and so forth.
Now, you mentioned the country club. I get the impression from the stories, just that I've heard. How would you characterize your life growing up economically? Were you,
Middle class. And yeah, middle class.
and how was that relative to other people in town or the people that you were
Well,
friends with?
There was, at least I knew from my high school friends, who seemed to have, just, when you're a teenager, how you make judgments kind of thing, that they belonged to a more expensive golf club, country club, and their homes were probably a little bit grander type of thing. But we didn't have this real stark contrast, like we didn't have old money and people really wealthy. And certainly we were, I think we were middle class. We always had nice clothes. We lived in a red brick house, colonial house, with 4 bedrooms. It was bigger than Sheila and David's first house. It's not too different than Ed's, but it was a center staircase, kind of colonial. And it was a house that Mom and Dad built near the end of the Depression. Mother was expecting me, and there were already four girls, and so they built this this brick house, and Dad would go over every day after work and check things out and see how they were doing and pick up nails.
Make sure they were stable, they weren't wasting.
Oh, okay.
And Glenna would go to
So-
Ripple oftentimes.
Right, and so they moved in November, and I was born, January 9th. So it was moved into a new house.
And the reason they decided to make that leap is that the city of Appleton was offering a couple of years of free property tax if people would buy and build a house.
Okay.
So they felt that they could swing it. But Mother certainly, both of them, especially Mother, was affected by the Depression. She told me how she would not be able to sleep at night, wondering how they were going to pay the bills and whether her life insurance policy would need to be cashed in. and she would cut up like Dad's. He would bring home felt, was it, from the
Yeah.
mill?
Right, they had in the rollers, how it, I think it was was on top of the rollers and probably some of the moisture in the pulp. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but they definitely used them in the making of the paper.
Mhm.
And Mother had used those, one winter she made a coat for each one of my older sisters. And so we have a picture of them all with their coats made out of mill felts
Okay,
that she made.
okay.
In fact, mill felt is what, I don't know if you remember when we had the table, and I would put it on the table before I put a tablecloth on.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Those are mill felts.
Okay.
And,
It was a wool-looking fabric.
Yes,
almost,
exactly.
that's,
Yeah.
soft enough.
and Mother we had a nice yard in the back, and during the summer of ours, she grew lots of vegetables.
Mhm.
She had that was another thing that she loved to do. She had a beautiful flower garden, but she also had a considerable
Vegetable garden.
vegetable
In the
garden.
was in the back of the yard, right up against the Fox River. Is that right?
Well, it was up on the hill and the Fox River was down below it, but we didn't have any neighbors behind us. The neighbors was the mill.
Yeah. Okay.
You see, the thing too, Mother told me later, is that after she didn't have to sew anymore, she didn't, because it was such a difficulty, trying to keep the girls enclosed during the Depression, that it wasn't really fun for her. It was,
Yeah.
But she continued to like gardening, and she loved that and cooking.
Yeah. But one thing that all your clothes you wore growing up as young kids, your mom made.
Well, that and a woman she had grown up with in Appleton when they were, when she was a kid, they lived on a city block, and their house was on one corner and another corner was the Morey family.
Okay.
And one of the Morey girls, I know of three, there was Florence and Rose and Edna. And Edna and Rose didn't marry, but Florence did, and she married a doctor in Dr. O'Hara. And they lived in Milwaukee. And Dr. O'Hara had a much higher income than my father. And that, in addition to the fact they only had two children. They had Mary and John. So Mary had very nice clothes.
Okay.
And so Florence would, I don't know how I suppose when they saw each other, she would give my mother a lot of Mary's clothes. And so Glenna certainly wore them before I did, and I don't even know if Sue did. I don't know where Mary is, I think contemporary of Sue.
Right.
I'm not sure. So beautiful, beautiful things.
Yeah.
And so they came down to me.
Yeah.
And so that was one source of our clothes. And I remember when I was a sophomore in high school, I had saved up money from working and babysitting, and I went to the store and bought a coat, and that was my first new coat.
Yeah. And how old were you about that?
Well, I probably was 16.
16. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right in that area.
Was work like your own work? Did your parents encourage you to work at a young age to babysit or
Yeah.
whatever other kind of jobs?
Paper work, doing paper too.
I started babysitting when I was in 4th grade,
Okay.
and the going rate then was 25 cents an hour, and
That's pretty good.
I got 50. And I decided, even then I knew it was a good deal,
Yeah.
and I better hang on to this job,
Yeah.
And so I was a family just that lived on the same side of the street that we did,
Yeah.
and was about 5 houses up.
Yeah.
And it was Jean and John Hayes, who had one son, Tom, who was a little bit older than Michael, and then the next son was Jim, and John Hayes was a salesman. Do you know what he sold? I don't know, he was a salesman, but he also was a very good golfer.
Mhm.
And he was at the caliber of winning like club championships and that kind of thing. And most of the boys, they ended up having 4, I think. TJ was the youngest one. There was
JP.
Danny, JT?
JP.
JP. So it was Tom, Johnny, Danny, and then JP. And JP won the Westchester Open one year since
What was the last name?
Hayes.
JP. Oh, really?
It was just in the paper
Wow.
all sorts of headlines about him the last week.
Oh, was it?
He disqualified himself because he had used a
Yeah,
not a regulation ball.
right. So, okay, make sure I got one. So J.P. Hayes' dad lived,
The family lived just down the block.
Right.
well, then who'd you babysit? You babysit his brothers?
Yeah, older brothers.
Yeah. And I went to kindergarten with his oldest brother, Tom.
Oh, okay.
You know, and I
That's
suppose,
interesting.
I turned out to be like a mother's helper, we never called it that.
Yeah.
But, because she would, and now that I think about that, would have me iron,
Yeah.
and so, you know, and I, probably not when I was 10,
Yeah.
but as I got a little bit older, and I think back about that now because I do have a clear memory of mothers, you know, showing me how to iron and then gave me some things to iron, you know. And so it was all fine, except I noticed, I saw her afterwards re-ironing everything that I had ironed. You know, no, I don't remember anything ever being said, and I probably didn't let her know that I knew that, but I was very disappointed. And so I remembered that I don't know if you remember how you used to like to wash the kitchen floor.
No, but.
Tim, like, you know, a sponge and a pail, and I remember Mrs. France coming over and saying, "You let Tammy wash the floor," and I, you know what, whatever you did, you know, was fine. I would never discourage that, and I never, you know, redid it. Whatever you did was okay. Except, I mean, obviously, if there was big puddles of water, that had to be taken up. But
That's interesting.
you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think that ironing experience sort of influenced me on that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
It's more important to encourage than to.
Yeah.
I like to get back to the depression issue in the golf club.
Yeah.
Dad was a charter member of Butamore Golf Club in Appleton.
Uh-huh.
And that was one of three in the valley. Another one was Riverview. Was that a little bit higher class in Appleton? And then there was North Shore for the Nina Menashe crowd, as Mother would say.
Mm-hmm.
And then that explained as people who were more in the paper company, in the ownership of the paper companies and that kind of thing.
Yeah, because Nina Menashe was next to Appleton, and there was a strong division between mill workers and the management.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, the mill workers lived in Menashe. They were Polish or German or Irish immigrants.
Okay.
The Nina owners were mainly from the east, and they were WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from New York and so forth. And they were very anti-Catholic. And in fact, up until the 1930s, there was no Catholic church in Nina.
Okay.
It was under law that no Catholic church would be allowed to be built there. And so the secretary for Kimberly Clark, which was the big paper company, happened to be a Catholic. His name was it Frank Sensenbrenner or John? I forgot which one it was. But anyway, he was highly respected because of being treasurer of Kimberly Clark, and he bought this land across from the high school on Division Street, and either sold it or gave it to the diocese. So then the diocese assigned to Father Gleckstein to build a church. And since it was on 600 block in Division Street, he asked for the address 666 Division Street from the Book of Revelation, because anti-Catholics were saying the beast in the Book of Revelation, marked by the sign of the beast, is 666, and that's the Pope of Rome, you know. So he was just trying to. But that was so different than our experience in Appleton, where you didn't have that. We had Lutherans and Catholics, but we got along okay, you know. And there was, my mother, you know, used to say about Butamore, same thing I think we say about the culture in Appleton. It was as much more democratic, much more of a sense of equality and mutual acceptance than you'd find in Nina Menashe, where you have this division between social strata and economies and religion and so forth. You didn't have that tension in Appleton, at least that we were aware of.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a very positive atmosphere to grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
I
mean, how big was Appleton?
At that time, 20,000, 25,000 in the early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And about 40% Lutheran, 40% Catholic, and the rest were other faiths.
Okay.
But you also had Lawrence University, so there was an intellectual element there that was very positive, and you had the security of the paper industry, and you had good leadership. One of our bishops used to say that all the new ideas come from Appleton.
Okay.
There was a sense of entrepreneurship
Mhm.
and a positive attitude
Mhm.
and a feeling that you can get things done and you can make a positive community. People had a real, and continue to have, in our area, a very strong commitment to community and to family.
And you, as you think back on it now, you see that growing up, that you were, as kids, you were involved in the community.
Oh, very much so.
Now, was that at school or church, or how was it?
Well, I was telling Nancy, I remember when she was in high school, at least two things. One, she was a cheerleader at Appleton High,
Mhm.
so she's very active there, but also at the YMCA, at the Terror's Den, which was the youth center, where we, officially, as Catholics, we weren't supposed to be involved in that, were we?
Right, right, in the YMCA,
Yeah.
you shouldn't. But I think the way we figured it was that really the YMCA, it was this, somehow it was the Applin High School Terrace Den.
Yeah.
It was in the building of the Y, but I don't know if there was
No.
really any
And what were you supposed to be involved with, the YMCA?
YMCA.
because it wasn't Catholic, it was sort of this
So since it was a Christian organization, but it wasn't a
Catholic.
Catholic organization.
Yeah, I think the objection was that they would use money to send Protestant missionaries out into Latin America and that type of thing.
Okay.
But for us, that was not an issue.
Right.
Even our oldest sister Pat was involved in the 30s. And that's an interesting point. She was a classmate of Jim Pate.
Yeah,
And when Jim was up a couple of years ago talking about high school days at Appleton High and St. Mary's and so forth, he mentioned that their class was about the first class to be involved with social or service activities through the YMCA, through the Terror's
Oh.
Den. And I was thinking that, until a society gets to a certain point economically, and certain cohesion socially, you're not going to have that social ethic developing. But, already in their time, in the late 30s or early 40s, you're beginning to see that at the Terror's Den, and you had families like ours who were very strongly Catholic, but just wouldn't buy this attitude that Catholic kids could be part of this.
Mm.
I think Mom and Dad particularly because of his business contacts, had a broader worldview,
Mm-hmm.
and they
Right.
just were willing to depart from the Father Grace's, whatever it is.
Right.
but going back to leadership, I don't know at grade school level, I don't remember it particularly, but I know in high school, I think I became the editor of the paper. We had a weekly newspaper.
Mm-hmm. For your high school.
Right, so I became the editor, well, as a co-editor, there was another one. So I became an officer in every group that I belonged to.
Mm-hmm.
Not cheerleaders, but there was Spanish Club, there was Quill and Scroll, which I'm not too sure what that was about writing. There was the Latin Club. Yeah, I think that was kind of like the beginning of, and it didn't seem like, it just seemed to be something I should do. I mean, it wasn't like anything unusual.
Right. And were all your siblings, your sisters, similar in that role, that they're active in school?
I don't know about Dorothy, Sue certainly was.
Yeah.
And Glenna was not. In fact, she went to St. Mary's High School in Mashpee because she wasn't a strong student and was sort of always a little bit different, bunch of different drummers. So she went to St. Mary's, but while she was at St. Mary's, she developed a tremendous reputation, I found out later. I mean, people really liked her and respected her. She had a lot of energy, and she really made a name for herself. And I think it was a good move that she could be out under the shadow of Sue and all of her sisters.
Right, because Sue, she was next in line, Sue, and then Glenna, and then myself. And it was Mother's concern that Sue had been such a strong student
Yeah.
and leader, and then Glenna, who maybe had a reading, I mean, she was always difficult for her to read. So, I mean, now we call it dyslexia and we call it different things. I certainly don't know, but it
Right.
could be that she was just simply doing some of the things that we now know, like reversing letters and,
Right.
and so forth. So, I sure struggled.
Right.
I'd like to go back and talk a little bit about my entrance
Yeah.
into the world. My dad was 50 and my mother was 46 when I was born. And his mother told me later in life, she said, Mike, we really weren't expecting you. And in fact, she went through some serious depression, she told me. I suppose you remember that.
No, I didn't.
Oh,
You
did
know
you
how
know
I heard about that?
No.
When you were saying Mass at St. John's and Mayapack, and this was part of your homily.
Oh, really?
That's how I found out about it.
Yeah.
Good,
So let him tell the story better
good
than
Irish Irish Catholic communication, right?
That's right,
That's
that's right. Well, the way I told the story, of course, you know the punchline already kind of, but the whole abortion issue, I said, that the argument is made that a woman should not be forced to have an unwanted child. And I said, I tell a story about a woman that I knew from Wisconsin who was pregnant at 46 and who was very surprised. She had 5 older daughters. Being a nurse, she was afraid of a child with Down syndrome or some other birth defect. And she underwent severe depression. She told me that she would wake up in the middle of the night and think about going down to the Fox River and jumping off the bridge. And today, if she were pregnant, there were people who would say, Dorothy, you should get an abortion. But fortunately, she didn't choose that, and my father, her husband supported her. And after difficult pregnancy, she had a healthy baby boy. And years later, she told me the story. And I'm so glad that she did, because that woman was my mother, I'm the child.
Yeah.
So, apparently my dad was quite happy. They say he went up and down College Avenue with cigars.
Fine, I had a son.
Yeah. But prior to,
Oh, they had a bet, didn't they have a bet with our family doctor? And that was when you just went to a doctor for everything, you had a family doctor. And he said that if there was a son, he was going to there'd be no charge. He would do the delivery free, right?
well,
Wasn't
that's
that-
true, but there's some other
Oh.
angles on that that you may or may not be aware of. He made that commitment as he and was it Joe Plank was the oldest?
Yeah.
And Norm Brown and Mother, for some reason, the 4 of them were going to Monte Verno Retreat House for some doings. And Mother was pregnant with me. And on the way out, these 3 guys were,
Yeah.
waxing eloquent. And Joe Plank said, well, if it's a boy, I'll open up his first bank account. And Norm Brown said, if it's a boy, I'll buy him his first pair of long pants. And Doc Hagner said, if it's a boy, I'll deliver him for free. And Mother, of course, being very practical German, said, Doc, I got 2 witnesses. You better follow through. So he did. He delivered me for free. And Mother told me, you know what that cheapskate did? He charged $15 for circumcision. So years later, I get this letter in the mail from the bank saying, if you don't use your savings account soon, it will be absorbed. I said, Dad, what is this? So that must have been the one that Joe
Plank started for him.
And Norm Brown didn't give me my first pair of long pants, but he did buy a pair of tailored long pants for me later on.
Yeah.
12 or 13.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So people were good to the word, huh?
Right.
That's right.
Right.
But again, going back to Unimog, my mother told me that during the Depression, as they were going through these tremendous financial difficulties, the one thing she didn't want Dad to drop was his membership at Unimog. Because she said he deserved that, he needed that for himself, because he gave so much to her and the family that he should have something where he could have some pleasure and some recreation.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so that was the relationship that that they really worked on, and mother kept emphasizing how important communication is. That was the key to a good relationship. And I was telling Nancy just as we got out of the car that she had little use for my grandfather, Dennis Carroll, at least things that she shared. Apparently, at one point, the family moved from this on the Fox River, the south side of the Fox River, to another place, the north side, called John Street. And my grandfather never talked to his wife about this. My mother just thought that was unforgivable for a husband to make a decision like that without his wife's input, which I can understand. And in fact, later on, this surfaced again in her relationship with my dad, because when I was in 3rd grade, the new St. Mary's grade school was being built.
Mhm.
And of course, they were looking for donations for certain things, and my father, being very patriotic and so forth, decided he would like to do something, and he got I think a bonus or something at that time. And decided to use the bonus to buy the flagpole, which he did without talking to my mother.
Flagpole for your house.
No, for the school.
For the
School.
Okay.
Well, my mother was just irate. So here is,
She could think of other things to do with that money.
Yeah.
so but they had a very, very close relationship, and like, we were talking before about how it started. When mother died, in the summer of '62, right after I graduated from high school, people said, your parents were not married for 40 years. They had a love affair that lasted for 40 years. They really, really had that closeness.
Yeah.
And when my mother used to say, the thing that made her feel so proud is when people would come to their house and say, this truly is a home of love.
Mm.
And like I was feeling the same way last night at David and Sheila's. I just said to Sheila this afternoon, your house is so open, it's a place where people gather for love.
Mhm. Mhm.
So anyway, we sold the house later on after she died, and Dad died, and stepmother died. About 20 years later, I was encouraged to go back to the house to meet the people who had bought it and who had renovated it. They had been there about 16 years. So I parked the car in front. I went up the driveway, and the husband was outside. He said, can I help you? Who are you? I said, my Carroll, I used to live here. He said, oh, yes, my wife would love to see you. So I went in, and you could see how they added on and made changes. She was so excited. She showed me upstairs and where Nancy's room had been, and we went downstairs, and we stood in the front entrance area, and she said, we were looking 16 years ago, she said, we were looking at different homes, and looking at the north side of Appleton, and I just wasn't so satisfied. So I saw that this house was available, and so I came with my husband to see this house, and I walked in the front door, and I looked to the right, to the room that had been our dining room, looked to the left, to the room that had been our living room. And she said to herself, this truly is a house of love. Like the spirit of love continued to permeate that building. The spirit of love continued to be there, and I'm just totally in awe of that.
You felt that growing up. That was
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of guests or.
There was a lot, yes, it was open, and there was a lot of entertainment. A lot of it was relative to my dad's business, where at that time salesmen could take out, could entertain, and they would entertain my dad, and my mother would, of course, be included in it. So they'd have drinks at our house and go out, but then there was also some holiday times family. But there wasn't, to the extent that like Sheila and David do, or maybe even that we did, with you kids, there wasn't really a lot, but it was always open. There was certainly, I always felt comfortable bringing friends over anytime.
the mother would have bridge club over there.
Yeah, that's right, she loved to play bridge.
She was a great hostess, which was amazing because when she was a girl, she told me that she was so shy that when visitors would come to their home, the Millhop home, she would run upstairs and hide under her bed.
Oh, really?
I said, Mother, how did you ever get over that? And she said, when I married your father, as Nancy said, he would be invited out by these traveling salesmen, and she would need to go along as his wife. And so she said, I had to learn how to relate, how to conduct conversations, and I did it for your father's sake.
And she got good at it.
Yeah, she got good at it.
Very good.
Yeah, she got good at it.
When did she pass away?
1962?
She's 64 years old.
Yeah, it was 6 weeks before Kelly was born.
Did she do it
Before or after?
Before.
Before. Right. That's right.
So she died in July 18th, and Kelly was born August 30th.
Okay.
And so, yeah, I remember really missing her when that was the days when you stayed in the hospital for a few days after you had your,
Right.
baby.
Right.
And,
Would she have come out? Like, would she come out to New York?
uh,
Or you
we
were
were
in
in Madison, Wisconsin.
Okay, right. So she would have been there.
Yeah.
Okay. And then she died suddenly?
Oh, yeah.
She had a stroke. She was at a friend's house, and they were playing bridge with three friends who had done it for years, but apparently they hadn't gotten together for some time, maybe a few months or whatever. I'm not sure what the interval was, but she was raising a toast to say, let's not wait so long before we get together again, and she had a stroke.
What was interesting from my standpoint is that I was in the seminary at the time. I was a senior in high school. And we were planning a surprise 40th wedding anniversary for mom and dad in August.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was in study hall and I said, there's a quote in the book of Proverbs, I thought, about a good wife. And I thought I should get that quote and use it for some type of a prayer service. And a very strong kind of a premonition or message came to me: don't bother. It won't be necessary. Well, I went into the library anyway, and I couldn't find anything. Well, I graduated, and then a couple weeks later, we had a woman over to the house for our cookout. She had moved from New York with her husband a few years before. She was about 44 at the time. And mother and dad had come to know them and liked them and so forth. But all of a sudden he died of a heart attack, and she was widowed. So she came over, and we were talking, and she said to mother, I would imagine you're looking forward to Mike's ordination. And mother said, no, I won't be around that long.
Did you really?
We haven't told you this. And so then I, at the same time, was getting strong premonitions that she was going to die. And it sounds so weird to put this into words because it is weird. I remember sitting up in the bathroom up in the second floor looking over the back yard and garden. Mother was back there with the flowers walking around. I thought to myself, I wonder how long it's going to be before she dies.
And how long was it?
Well, it was just a few weeks.
Oh, a few weeks, okay.
But, there was no evident reason for her to die, except that she had high blood pressure and she refused to take medicine. She just had a phobia about pills.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the type of thing, But Dad and I then later on looked back and said, she must have felt this. For one thing, she went to confession, and she hardly ever went to confession, but she seemed to be preparing herself. And so, anyway, I had this sense, and sure enough, I was at work and was called to the hospital, and she'd had this stroke, this cerebral hemorrhage, and by the time I got there, she had died, but Dad got there before she died, and was able to be with her. There are three priests who saw her. The one who anointed her said that when he anointed her, she clasped his forearm and squeezed it. She knew what was happening. She was ready. But she had always said that she prayed to live to see me through high school. Then she would know her duty was done.
Mm-hmm.
And she and Dad were having a great time. I went to the seminary when I was a sophomore. They had not been very
Sophomore college?
high school.
Sophomore high school.
They didn't want me to go after 8th grade, and so I didn't. But then after one more year, they said, yeah, he really would be happier there. So I went, and then it was the next year, Mother told me, they had gone to Florida together. She said to me, Mike, it's not that we're glad to get rid of you, it's just that your dad and I enjoyed being alone. I said, I understand now. But for me, that was a turning point in my own faith life, because on the way from the hospital, Dad said something that was very surprising. He said, Mike, I want to live. I don't want to die. And the reason I was surprised is that I thought he was going to say, I want to be with your mother. But that's not what he wanted. He wanted to continue to live.
Yeah.
But I had to deal with what I believed. I mean, rather what I believed about God and life after death. I knew what my parents believed. I knew what the priest taught me, I knew what my teachers taught me, but what did I believe? And I knew that I had to face the possibility the whole thing was false, that it was
Yeah.
a crock, you know? But I knew if I didn't take that risk, I could never have an adult faith. And so that was the first really strong faith experience of my life, was when my mother died. And I remember too, well, no, that was in the old liturgy with the black,
Oh, for the funeral.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wait, lights on?
What, you want lights?
Yeah, just under that.
This here?
Go ahead. No, overhead?
Yeah, right there on the wall to the left of the cupboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, is that true? Okay. Do you remember anything else about Mom's death or about the funeral or anything?
Oh, well, as far as, I was in, your dad and I were in Madison, and I was working. My job was, I was assistant dietitian for one of the residence hall at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. So I was working, and I was,
Athletes, was it the athletes hall?
well, yeah, that's where a lot of the athletes stayed, and was it Van Heist was the name of it? So it was one of the smaller of the residence halls. Some of them were, but nonetheless, it was still a pretty big operation. And so I was standing behind the food line, supervising and making sure things were being done. And I turned and looked, and there was your father.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there'd be no reason for him to come. And so he must have walked in and went through the, and came in and told me that my mother had died.
Yeah.
So we came home.
Yeah.
We drove up to Atherton for that. So I mean, it was like anything else when it's sort of a surprise. You're in shock. You don't get the impact of it. And I think what I vividly remember is when Kelly was born, and really then getting the full impact that she wasn't there. This huge event in your life or in my life, she wasn't there with me.
She was a big part of your life.
Well, yeah, sure.
You didn't always get along well, as mothers and daughters oftentimes don't, did you? Remember that in high school? I mean, it was just typical growing up. I think it just, it's a matter of becoming independent. Just like I remember when I was like 17, I think it was the summer before Mom died, thinking, I'm distancing myself. I've got to be distant emotionally if I'm going to be open to a relationship with other women. I think that's part of going through your teenage years. But,
now, Mike, when you so you went to seminary, and you said in 10th grade,
yes.
and that was so you stayed somewhere that was like a boarding situation. So you weren't you didn't live at home anymore.
Correct.
Was that in Appleton also, or
Oneida.
Oneida. How far was that from home?
Well, about 40 minutes.
About 40 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
What made you?
All the guys were going there.
That was the thing to do.
Yeah. But I guess I remember being in 7th grade and figured that's the last thing I want to do is be a priest.
Yeah.
But by the time I was in 9th grade, that's really what I thought I'd like to do.
Yeah.
And a lot of my classmates had gone there, but they had left.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that I really went through some of the conflicts, teenage conflicts later on.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think maybe I didn't mature as early as I would have otherwise if I would have stayed in high school.
Mm-hmm.
Which, you can't turn back the clock. There are many good things about being in seminary, but, some of the healthy struggles that you have.
Adolescent struggles.
Yeah, they wouldn't let you have a picture of me, so I didn't think that was very cool.
They what?
They didn't let you have a picture of me in your room.
At the seminary?
Yes.
Really?
Yes, you told me that you were told to put that away.
Oh, Lord. It was pretty weird.
Girls are tough. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. We had a rector who was a little weird. But it was not, he represented much of the thinking in those days.
Yeah.
We were told before summer vacation not to talk to any girls unless they were our first cousins, and not to talk to any boys that we were in grade school with, if they were in the seminary, for fear we'd lose our vocation.
So,
Okay. Oh, because they had you. I had you on the hook, so to speak, and didn't want to do
little
Yeah.
control,
It's only control, yeah.
right?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And then on back on your parents, then your dad got remarried.
He did, and they came, you were born in 1968, and they were married in
67,
67?
because he died in 68.
Okay, so he died right,
In October 13th, 68.
so it was right before Michael was born. I mean, Timothy were born
Yeah, because Chris was born,
after that. Chris is a little bit younger than you.
I think so.
Oh, that's right, the first of all was they came out for their wedding, the party. They were married in Appleton, and then Mildred had a son who was married and living in the east, and then Sue, the Heinrichs were in Darien, and then your dad and I were in Mayapack. So the three couples, and we met them at the plaza in
Wow.
the city for dinner. And, we had a nice dinner, and then, and I remember, Dad, he was such a gentleman. I'm trying to think of somebody who reminded me, but anyway, he gave them their tip, and there was a little conversation about that. Apparently, the waiter didn't think it was sufficient,
Mm-hmm.
and,
we were frugal in West Virginia.
yeah, well, he probably, based on, in Wisconsin, he probably
Sure.
felt it was, certainly an adequate
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
whatever. But, so that would have been in 1967, and then Tim was born in December of 1968. So, yeah, so Dad never saw you then, because he died in October and you were born in December.
So I was born in December '67.
67, oh.
Yeah.
Oh, so, well, they would have known Tim, or,
Oh, that's right, you were 67. So then I was pregnant when they were married and came out for that party. That's right.
did you come to Appleton for the?
No.
No, I don't remember being there either. Somebody said I was there for the wedding.
Well, I'm sure.
I don't remember that at all.
So
There,
dad '68.
So then the fact is, they were there, then they would have been there in October, the end of October or something. I was expecting you, and then, but nonetheless, he died and never really saw you because they didn't come back
Yeah.
after you were born.
And then, so he died in '68, and then Mildred was alive quite some. Because I have memories of her.
Okay.
So when did she die? In the early '70s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know.
74, I think.
Okay. And your dad died in '68. Was that similar to your mom, or sudden, or was he sick?
He was in, we had a small room, we called it the sunroom, but it was a small room with television, just like lots of houses have, and a couch, and it was the first season after Vince Lombardi left, right?
Yeah, Phil Benson was,
And,
Coaching the right
and the
way.
Packers were not doing so well, and he was yelling and telling them what to do,
Mhm.
and Mildred said she would say, Glenn, it's only a game, and they're getting paid for it.
Mhm.
And he was upset and
died.
had a heart attack and died.
But did you complain for the Packers?
No. Next thing got
But,
fired.
basically, you think of how wonderful it is, they both died doing
With
what
their
they
boots
love
on.
to do.
And both of them prayed for that.
Yeah.
They both asked the Lord to take them with their boots on.
Yeah.
You know. Mother loved to play cards, and Dad, he really loved the Packers.
Yeah.
And going there for the games and that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Need to go back though, before Mom died, she and Dad would talk sometimes, and she would talk about what if.
Mhm.
She said, Glenn, if I go first, I don't know what you're gonna do without me, you can hardly boil water. You know? And then she would say,
But you didn't have to.
no.
You didn't have to. She,
She did that. I mean, she.
She took
she's
care of
very
everything.
competent. She's very competent and very,
The other thing she used to say is, Dad, she said, if I go first, I want you to wait for a year out of respect for my memory. And then you should remarry. You should have that companionship. And he said, well, Dorothy, don't talk that way. She said, no, you should have that companionship. And then she would tell him all the different women to avoid. but didn't tell him who he should pursue. So he was a little bit at a loss after she died. He did this one and that one. In the meantime, he also, as I think I mentioned to you, needed to retire from combined locks. He was 69 years old. That would have been about probably 63 or 64. And he decided he'd have to keep busy. He went into business on his own, selling paper chemicals and waste paper. And so he was doing that, but his love life was a bit meager. And so one day I was home for Easter vacation. That was probably in 66, and he had cancer. He had broken his collarbone.
At
And
my house,
at your house in
Mayapet.
Oh, I didn't know.
He
Tell the
was,
story.
he was helping me, we had those roses, the driveway and along the left hand, if you're going into the garage, it was on the left-hand side. And so he was showing me how to edge, taking, a spade with that straight edge and to get a nice edging. And he dropped the spade and held his shoulder. And he was, obviously was in a lot of pain. And so I don't remember that I remember very clearly being out there with him. I don't remember if he cut short his visit, how long he, had planned, but I suspect he came out just to see us and not as part of a larger trip, but I don't know. But when he got back, Pat called me to tell me, what it was, and that he had multiple myeloma, which is
Virulent form of bone cancer.
Oh.
And was Pat still?
Yeah, she was alive.
Yeah,
died
she
in
was alive.
72, I think.
Right.
So he didn't, but he didn't.
No. What happened is that the surgeon gave him 6 months to live.
Yeah.
But the family doctor, Dr. Claypool, who later became my doctor and Dorothy's doctor for a while, put him on chemotherapy on Cytoxin, which was developed in Madison at the University Hospitals.
Wow.
And
I mean, that was, I'm sure I assume that was new and rare at that time to be on chemotherapy.
well, I don't know how rare it was, but this is one of the first, I think, really blockbuster medicines. It's still used today.
Wow.
In chemo. But when he eventually did die, the heart attack, I said to Dr. Claypool, I said, Doc, that chemo was fantastic. I mean, he didn't have any side effects. And he said, Mike, there was a lot more there than just chemistry. His dad really prayed that he'd be able to live. He wanted to see me ordained a priest at our parish in Appleton, so that we could then have our friends and relatives over to the house for a reception afterwards. So that was his reason for living, and so he prayed it, and the cancer regressed, and by that time he had started a relationship with Mildred. And what happened is that I was home one Easter, and we had been batching it, and I remember the first time, it must have been summer of '63, I was home in the seminary, and he was cooking hamburgers or something, and I thought, Dorothy had said at one point, when our mother expressed some amazement that Dorothy had baked a cake, and Madison at the comment, honestly, Mother, anybody who can read can cook or bake. I thought, I could do that. So I went into the shelves, and there was instant mashed potatoes. So I took it out and read it, probably not too thoroughly. Whipped it up, and it looked like, at best, wallpaper paste. So I said right away, I said, Dad, let's make a deal. You cook, I wash. He said, okay. So he did okay. I mean, we made it. But that Easter, he said to me, Mike, Mildred Ely has invited us down for supper. Well, I met Mildred, I think, twice, and I really liked her. She was tall, elegant woman, and very warm and very real, just a fine woman. She had been a classmate of mother's in nursing school, but she was Presbyterian. In fact, she was a deacon in the local Presbyterian church. So, that's great, and also, fortunately, Mildred was also of the same philosophy as our mother, that the best way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So she pulled out all the stops. She had her best food. She had 2 kinds of wine. So on the way home, I said, Dad, I think it's time to get serious. So they started dating, and he told her about his cancer, and then we came out to that, before they were in, we came out that one time, and Mildred was visiting her kids, and Dad and I came out to visit you and the Heinerses, and we got together at Palisades Park overlooking the Hudson. Remember that, across from New York City? We had a family cookout.
No, I don't remember that.
I remember this, Sue came up to me, and Dad and Mildred were over on a park bench, kind of making eyes at each other, you know, and she said, "Are they getting serious?" I said, so sure enough, well, then you know the rest of the story. And then after they had married, they would send us letters, you know, what they were doing. I remember either you or Sue said, "We can't keep up," you know. I was just even reading the stuff makes us tired, you know. But they both had wonderful marriages and had spouses that they loved dearly and had lost their spouses. Never thought they'd have that happiness again, and here they did.
I know.
And he treated her like a queen, and she treated him like a king. They were just like 2 teenagers in love.
Yeah.
Well, the next spring, Dad told me that I could go to Catholic University that summer, '68. He had talked to the diocese and it all set up. I thought, that's cool, so I went. Well, I didn't.
Catholic University was in Washington.
Washington, yeah.
So,
And that was after King's assassination, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, the riots.
Okay.
It was a very, very pivotal summer, you know,
Yeah.
Vietnam. But I will not confess how many years it took for me to figure out why that all happened. He had a new bride, he didn't want his kid around.
But he was still 64 so at the time, right? I mean,
No, by this time he was 73,
oh, he was 73. Okay.
but a young 73.
Okay.
Yeah. So during
Oh,
the,
okay, that's right. Okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
and
Well, what year was he born? Born in 1896?
two,
1892.
yeah.
no,
No, four.
94,
44.
94.
Yeah, so he would have been 74. in
74 when, 74 when he died. He died at
74 when he
69.
He died 11 months after they were married.
Yeah.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, I was in Washington, I was thinking, you know, that maybe it's time for me to take a break from seminary life. I've been in the system, you know, and see the world and so on and so forth. I didn't tell Dad this. And again, he had been praying to see me, as I said, ordained at the parish, which was very, I don't think he knew what he was what he was praying for, because that never happened. It was always at the cathedral.
Okay.
But anyway, keep that in mind. So I went back to the seminary in St. Paul, and that was the semester I really need to decide whether to leave or not, because the next June was diaconate ordination. Dad died. I came home, and I stood in front of his casket, in front of family and relatives and friends, and the thought struck me, it's only a priest that stands between life and death, heaven and hell in this way.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point on, I knew I'd be a priest.
Mm-hmm.
So no more thoughts of leaving. And the diaconate ordination, because my pastor was very highly respected, the bishop had it at St. Mary's in Appleton.
Oh, wow.
And a year later, I was ordained a priest there. In 1970, I was ordained a priest at St. Mary's in Appleton, just as Dad had prayed.
Yeah.
And afterwards, Mildred had a family and friends over to our house for a reception.
And she knew that was important to.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I see, you know, my dad's prayers being so powerful, and even his death ensuring my vocation.
Mm-hmm.
So needless to say, you know, we've grown up in that type of a experience of faith being real and in action.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and also faith, not just in those dramatic ways, but just day-to-day life that, you know, I think so many people say, well, you know, my parents were so religious, but I don't see it in the daily life. But we saw day-to-day, we saw that integration of life and faith and love, and it just all hung together so normally. Which are, you know.
Yeah, thinking of this morning when I was walking days, there was, you had asked some of the questions what it was like growing up and so forth, and my thought was, as I remember it, my growing up years was all really centered on family. there was limited amount of distractions outside of, the home. There was always dinner together, we always ate, and, yeah, it was, a lot of the play, activities in grade school and stuff was just right in the front yard or the backyard and up and down the street. It was just really focused on, on our family.
And was your dad home for dinner most
Yeah.
every night?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely.
Same time? What time was dinner, do you remember?
What time was dinner? Probably about 6, probably. And I remember, he had a sweet tooth, so we had what we called a breakfast room. So in other words, there was a kitchen and there was like an alcove and there was a drop leaf table but painted white with chairs, and along the side was like cabinets, built-in cabinets, upper and lower, and then a counter. And Mother, if she had baked, she had the baking out there, and so the first thing he would do is come in to see what was for dessert, and then every day, he was always checking on that. And it was a different time. Mother wore cotton dresses. They called them house dresses. I never remember seeing my mother in a pair of slacks. And she wasn't, her involvement in my life wasn't like mine with yours, or certainly what you do now with your kids, playing with them and so forth, or going.
So she was busy taking care of the house and things, and so the kids were.
Family,
There was a distinction between parents and children, so to speak.
Well, yeah, but I was thinking for a dress, she and I would play cards a lot together, and she would play games, and she would, we would cook, or she would show me things, but there would be no reason for her to wear slacks, or she was that kind of, thing, or she wouldn't go bike riding with me, or, that was what I did, so, she always made a point of changing her clothes before my father came home, so she always looked nice, and, and I was able to walk home from school at lunchtime, so we would have an hour and we'd come home and she would have lunch, a hot lunch made, and things like cream peas on toast.
Now, did you have, as kids, you have jobs around the house? Was
Yes.
that part of?
Yes. Right. And I was thinking today, what memories do I have from Pat? And I don't, growing up, she was 13 years older than I, so by the time I was 4, she would have graduated from high school and was gone. But I do of Dorothy, and it's not so much that I have really remembering doing a lot of things with her, but I do know that there was a close relationship, because she went away was a counselor at a Girl Scout camp, a couple of summers when she was in high school, and I still have notes that I wrote to her, and she wrote to me. And so when I was 9 years old, she graduated from high school and went to the convent. And I still remember that the kind of garage doors we had at that time, they folded like that. And so I went behind the garage door, and where that crack was between the two panels, because it was like partly folded, and as Mom and Dad and Dorothy backed out of the driveway, I stood there, looking through the crack, crying, because I felt as though I'd never see her again. That was. I remember that as being a big loss in my life, is that she was going away. And there was certainly a lot of preparation, because she had this list that she'd gotten from the community of things that she needed to have, and
Big trunk.
yeah, Mother had the trunk out. We had a porch in the back outside the kitchen, and she had it there. And as they made things or got it, like her towels, and Dorothy was wearing these habits, which were made out of what they called unbleached muslin, cotton. So Mother needed.
She was wearing that before she left?
No, but she needed to have that, so when she went, nightgowns, and she didn't make the habit, but Mother had to provide slips, I guess, and nightgowns, and I think they made that. But certainly towels, and then the names had to be sewed on, and black stockings and, this
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it was a process that went on for probably the whole summer
Yeah.
of collecting these things and packing it
Yeah.
and then getting it shipped.
Mhm.
And then mother was not very happy about Dorothy going to the convent.
Why is that?
But because she felt as though she was losing her daughter.
Mm.
And she was going to this place that was in the furthest southern western corner of the state.
Mhm.
So there was actually, of a diagonal. We were up, not all the way to the north, but
It's hard to get to.
yeah, it was hard to get to. There weren't super highways, and so it took and it
What drew Dorothy to the convent?
to the mother house. And,
What
drew her?
What drew her? What?
Oh, I think her relationship with the sisters during grade school.
Mhm.
The Dominican sisters taught in our grade school in Appleton.
Did somebody say that she expressed a desire to be a sister when she was 4 years old? I've heard that.
I mean, it's remarkable to think about that as your family. You have two sisters became nuns, obviously, and like.
Yeah.
I guess, do you have a thought about that? Is
And probably the
happened?
faith, the gift of faith that our parents had, and we received the gift of faith, but it was nourished by our parents through our home life.
And I think our father, even more than mom certainly had faith. And she was a strong believer, but she was the kind of person who put faith into action in a very practical way. Dad was much more of a Irish romantic, but I think the father, the husband, is the spiritual leader of the family. And I sense that in you and Ed too.
Mhm.
And in his faith, his strength, he would go to daily mass as often as he could. His commitment.
It was very good to the sisters at the parish.
Yes, he was. That was a good modeling.
And he was very good and generous to them, and not that I remember that so much as the sisters have told me when I go down there, and they say, "Oh, your father and mother, they were just so generous and wonderful to us."
Mm.
So that came many times.
So through your parents' eyes, it sounds like it was a very respected
Profession
or path of
right,
life.
Right.
Yeah.
Except that because the convent was so tight at that time, it seemed that once Dorothy left the family, she was gone forever. I mean, we did things loosened, fortunately, as the years went on. And the other thing is that because you didn't have a husband, she and Glenna both could be focused on family, and be
Yeah.
support to the parents.
I think mother came to understand that she didn't lose a daughter.
Yeah.
And certainly if mother had lived longer and been able to see the transition of religious communities, and certainly see what Glenna was doing.
Right.
And Dorothy would, go up to see Sue in Wausau. She'd get hop a ride with somebody who's going that way, and we'd go up and visit for a weekend or so, that kind of thing. That would again allay her concern about
Right.
Dorothy's, where they could be very much a part
Right.
of their life. But truly, but the community became their family, really.
Right.
But not excluding their birth family.
No, there was the Dominicans really tried to integrate the two.
Yeah. So.
Another interesting story from Dorothy's time. I've gotten to know Jean and Mary Page, and Jean was a classmate of hers in St. Mary's grade school. In fourth grade, the assistant priest, Father Scanlon, came in and pulled out a quarter. And he said, "This quarter will go to the student who writes the best essay on the title of Pride." So all the kids brought out their essays and came back, and most of them, of course, were about pride as one of the capital sins and da. But there was one that said, well, pride can be evil, it can be a sin, that's true, but it also can be very positive. I mean, if you have pride in your appearance, or your work, or your family, or your friends, that's a good thing. And that was the winning essay. That was from Dorothy.
Mm-hmm.
So I said to her later, I said, Jean still remembers it. And I said, "Dorothy, how did that ever happen?" And she said, I went home that night, and after supper, I was doing dishes with Mom, and I told her about this offer from Father Scanlon, and she's the one who gave me these ideas, which then she wrote down.
Mhm.
But I think that's a very tender story, you know, and how Mom affected all of you girls in teaching you how to be proud of yourselves and how to, you know, so when the leadership that you showed when you were in high school flowed naturally from this sense of confidence and this sense of pride and this sense of accomplishment. You both Mother and Dad were very competent in what they did. Mother's older sister, Olive, would say, Dorothy, how do you get so much work done? I just am tired watching you. She said, well, what I do is I'm doing one job and I'm thinking ahead to how to do the next one. So I just flow from one to the next. She was a very good housekeeper, a very good wife and mother, and I think the girls grew up with, you know, with that type of mentoring.
You were talking about sewing and Mother making clothes because she had to in order to. Well, when I was in grade school, I started taking dance lessons, and where some of my friends played basketball or was in a league and so forth, I was really doing dancing, and I could pay for it myself because I had babysitting money, and I could walk to the studio, and I continued that all through high school to the to the end, and
Dancing? Dancing?
Yep.
Okay.
And I became involved with a group called the Appleton Civic Ballet.
Okay.
And so my dance teacher and her husband would put on a ballet each year. And then they had the performance at the high school and sold tickets and so forth. But it seemed to me it was really a good performance, but I had nothing to measure it against. And we made our own costumes and so forth. Well, one year we were doing the can-can. Gaieté Parisienne, Gaieté Parisienne, and I was one of the can-can dancers. So the costumes are like a black satin with an underlying of skirts, and they put them up like this. And so Mother is in this little room in the front of the house in which she had her sewing machine, and wanted to know, how do we put the ruffles on? There were layers. She had these layers of lavender. Now, does she put the ruffles on the top side of the fabric, or do you put it on the underside